Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions in Depth Psychology, which, as you know by now, is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also a graduate of Pacifica in the Depth Psychology program there. And this series is dedicated to spotlighting some of the work and interesting research that is coming out in the depth psychology field at this time, and also some of the students, alumni, and faculty who are associated with Pacifica Graduate Institute and who are doing some wonderful research. And today I'm here with Lisa Pounders, who completed her MA in Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life from Pacifica, and who is also a third-year student in the Ph.D. in depth psychology with a specialization in Jungian and archetypal studies program. Lisa, thanks so much for spending some time with me today.
Oh, hey, Bonnie. Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Well, it's really great to have you because you have been doing some really remarkable work on art and also how Jung regarded art as it applies to his notion of individuation, and specifically around a particular artist, which I think we'll get into a bit more. But first, let me tell people a little bit more about you before we continue so that we have some background on you.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, Lisa did her MA in Engaged Humanities in the Creative Life program, and she's now finishing her Ph.D. in depth psychology in the Jungian and archetypal studies specialty there. And in 2016, her first peer-reviewed article was published in the International Journal of Jungian Studies, and she works as a mentoring psychologist, instructor, visual artist, and poet, and is currently transiting between her hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, and the high desert of Santa Fe, New Mexico. So that's great, Lisa. You are doing so many different things, and they all seem to be related to art and poetry and psychology. So it seems like you have really been able to bring these different topics together in a way that is quite profoundly depth psychological. And maybe you can start us off in our discussion today by sharing a little bit about how you as an artist came to Pacifica in the first place. What was it that actually drew you to the program there?
You know, it's funny because I often think about that myself. As you've probably heard from other people at Pacifica, it seems like you end up through sometimes mysterious ways getting called and kind of making your way to Pacifica, and that's what it feels like to me. As you say, I've always had these various interests, particularly in art and poetry, and at one point, though, I was looking around and wanting to get back in touch with working with people to take these different creative modalities and reach out and do more with people, including teaching, but also a sense of, I had in the back of my mind, psychology. And in the process of looking for what that meant, a friend at the time talked about going to a dream certificate program or a weekend, I think, at Pacifica where they had those special programs and mentioned it. And I'd never heard of Pacifica before, so I went on the website and looked it up and just had this instant resonance about it. It was the humanities program, and to me, it connected with the ideas I had from creativity being this process that has helped me to develop, and it connected with Carl Jung, who I wasn't that familiar with, but the ideas that were there resonated, is how I would say it. So I applied and got in and started the program, not with that much idea of what depth psychology was, but just my own personal sense that the unconscious and creativity were linked, and that seemed to be a way to move my own life forward.
Absolutely. I think that many of us who are listening to this can probably relate to something very similar. As you said, a lot of people who go to Pacifica, I think it's kind of a legend there that they are often drawn by some sort of a call, or sometimes it's a dream, sometimes it's a feeling. I certainly can only speak to my own experience, but once I arrived there, I just had some very powerful confirmation that it was absolutely the right program for me. And as we go there, however, I'm kind of interested in the idea that you didn't really know as much about depth or Jungian psychology once you arrived there. But obviously, over the course of getting your degree, you have come to some kind of conclusions about what you do see as the relationship between art, which was, again, kind of what drove you there in the first place, and depth psychology. Can you share about what you have found that relationship to be?
Yes. One of the things I'm thinking back now that drew me actually to it, Pacifica, was Joseph Campbell. I had, at the time in my studio, my own art studio, written above a window the phrase, "follow your own bliss." And when I found out that Joseph Campbell's library was there, that was another one of those threads. And to me, that's a little bit of where the idea between art and depth and Jungian psychology comes into play, is that idea in what Jung termed individuation, where there is this inner sense, inner drive towards following a path, towards a calling or a sense that there's other things in this life, not fate, but ways to develop and ways to kind of enrich your life and also perhaps enrich other people's lives. And so that first follow your own bliss was my call initially to go to art, and then that led me to Pacifica.
Well, I really love, Lisa, that you're making this connection between Jung and art, because this is an entire aspect of his psychology that I think in some ways is probably sort of underreported and maybe under-conversed about, and yet at the same time he did have some really powerful ideas about how art actually does contribute to the entire individuation process and how important it is for people to have some kind of a modality in which they actually pursue that creative process and allow it to emerge into something in the world. And of course, he had his own process of creating the Red Book, which he didn't share with a lot of people for quite some time until it was published recently in the last few years. But we know now that his own journey, so to speak, was heavily based on the material that came out of the work that he was doing at that time. And he's quite actually the painter and artist himself. When you start looking at the Red Book, it's remarkable to see the degree to which he actually spent time creating these detailed drawings. So can you say more about what you see as his contribution, his depth psychological perspective on art? And then I want to hopefully transition that into looking specifically at this topic that was, in fact, the focus of your article for the International Journal of Jungian Studies that we mentioned in your bio.
Yes, and you bring up a key point. For me, what's so exciting about Jung's theories and depth psychology is that the unconscious is inherently creative, that force driving towards development has this sense of creation and making and image making as well. And like you said, he discovered that on his own when he started in 1913 creating the Red Book, which he did. It was he called it his confrontation with the unconscious. It was after he had a falling out with Sigmund Freud, who was his mentor and kind of his first guide into the unconscious. And Jung and Freud had a falling out because Freud theories were about that sex was the basis for people taking care of their unconscious work. And for Jung, he saw it as being much broader. But when he was left on his own without Freud, it was this huge, what do I do now? No one had been there before. And so he started what he called later a process of active imagination, where he would drop down purposefully into his unconscious and start to imagine and have dialogues with these inner images and inner characters. And he did that also through writing and through painting and drawing and doing these beautiful, what I would call works of art, but these beautiful illustrations that spoke to him about the images. It was as if he was dreaming in a semi-conscious state. And a lot of his theories came later, what we can now trace after seeing the Red Book, back to the work he did on his own during that time and during that process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and such powerful work, too, when you begin to take into account the entire creativity piece. So again, it's not just art, and I don't mean that by any means to say less of the art itself, but the fact that he engaged with those images as living images in this process of active imagination, as you mentioned, I think really allowed it to come alive and to reveal some of the absolutely fascinating processes that were going on in his own psyche, and also to some extent in the collective psyche at the time as well. So it's really powerful stuff. And so the link that I'm making now as we move to talking about the article that you wrote is really to begin to understand how someone who, so I should back up and say the title of the article that you wrote is called Transformation Through Art, Exploring Jung's View of Art and the Relevance of Charlotte Salomon's Life or Theater, ? And I'll let you explain a little bit more about that title. But I'm looking at Charlotte Salomon and who she was, and of course our listeners won't necessarily know that just yet, but she obviously had a very large window in her life where creativity was coming through for her. And I think that it continues to this day. The work that she created is actually having impact on people who come across her work, just such as yourself and now me and now all of those who are listening to this at this time. Can you start us off by telling us a little bit who Charlotte Salomon was and the work that she created, and then we can go into a more formal discussion of how that creativity is actually impacting us.
Absolutely. Yes. It's interesting. Charlotte Salomon was a German Jewish woman who ultimately was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. But prior to that, she created this opus, this work that she titled Life or Theater, Life ? Or Theater, which for her, it's almost, and I write about this in the article, it's really difficult to explain what it is. It's been put into a book form, but it was a manuscript that had ultimately 769 paintings. And along with paintings, there's written text. And along with the text and the paintings, there's these transparent overlays that have directions for having music. And she called it in German a Singspiel, or a kind of opera. And she imagined someone looking at the images, reading the text, and humming the music. So she had this multimedia work that was fictional yet based on her life. So semi-autobiographical. She changed names of characters, but the characters and the narrative also reflect her life. So it's a complicated work by someone who was going through World War II and ultimately was murdered in the Holocaust. And we have this amazing surviving piece of work from her. Part of the work is her working through a series of suicides, or you could almost say a plague of suicides in her family, including her aunt, her mother, and her grandmother. And this work seems to be part of her way of choosing to not follow that same impulse.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that really has an impact on me when I hear you say it that way, because we begin to get just, I think, a glimpse of how the creative outlet can actually completely change people's lives and also provide a way for them to work through some of the trauma that they have experienced in their lives. And of course, we see that. We have art therapists today who often practice exactly that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you can share more about how you, well, first of all, I'm interested in how you found Charlotte Salomon's work, but also how did you begin to see her work as connected to Jung?
You know, her work, in a similar way that Pacifica finds us, and as an artist, different artists and work find me, it was around 1997, I think it was, when it was a Time magazine article. There was an exhibit of these images in the United States, and there was a book, a biography written by Feldsteiner. And I was in a book club, and I saw this magazine article, and I recommended that we read the book by Mary Feldsteiner, which was called To Paint Her Life, Charlotte Salomon in the Nazi Era, and it was 1997. And it gripped me, and I ended up finding in a used bookstore a bound copy of the Life or Theater called Charlotte. So 1981 was when that book was put together. It comes close to representing what she did. It doesn't have the overlays or anything, but it tries to represent the work in a book form. So these things have been on my shelf even before I came to Pacifica. And once I was at Pacifica, and it was a class actually in the humanities program on activism, on creativity and being an activist. And I started thinking about how this woman during the Nazi oppression created this work of art to try to say that, you know, I exist, I'm here, here's what's going on for me. And that to me seemed like an act of activism, something that we could still even today resonate with what went on. You know, that the work survived is part of the thing to me that just seems astonishing. And so in that class, it just started Jung's The Red Book, and here's another multimedia creative work where he's working through his own inner turmoil and has these paintings and these different writings in there. And then here's this woman who, 1940, and Jung worked on his from 1913 to, I think, 1930, on and off. And here I found this piece that was being worked on as well, not exactly the same time, but they just seem to have things in common, including a world war. Jung started his right before the First World War, and here was Charlotte doing hers during the Second World War.
Yeah, it's an interesting synchronicity. And I think that often when we get really interested in these kinds of topics, when these topics find us, as you succinctly put it, that we are onto something that is a pattern that is reaching out to us in some ways to almost bring us into this tapestry of ideas that can affect us profoundly in our own lives as well. And it's pretty clear, I think, from the synchronicities that existed between Jung and Charlotte, and also probably between Charlotte and some of the other works that you've been looking at yourself, or maybe even has affected your own art. I'm sure that you begin to see some of these patterns that emerge, and it brings some kind of understanding and almost some power, you know, whether it's wisdom or understanding or healing or whatever that is. I think that art often works on us in ways that we don't necessarily see or understand with our rational kind of mind, but we somehow either end up absorbing or it embodies something for us. We embody the art. There are a multitude of ways that it can affect us. Have you noticed that with both your own art processes and also with, for example, the work, and especially this particular work from Charlotte Salomon?
Well, yeah, you know, that's well said, Bonnie, because I do think, as you say, that these things work on us in ways that we don't understand, we keep coming to. I mean, that to me is part, again, that connection to Jung. If we start to look at what he talked about in the unconscious and in terms of what he recognizes symbols and then archetypes, and symbols being these sort of portals to this unknown area, these images that resonate, that seem kind of known, but at the same time are not fully, they remain mysterious. And then archetypes being these patterns or these potential formations that kind of inform our lives. And when we recognize them, I think, in art, because they seem naturally, inherently in artwork, not just visual, I could say, as you pointed out, not just what we, you know, classically say art, but creativity, works that come from that creative place. They speak to us in both conscious and unconscious ways. And I think part of the power of Charlotte Salomon's work, and true too of Jung's Red Book, was this using images and words and even music to try to express, to try to kind of get at what's happening inside, but also to communicate to other people. I think that there's a communication, a third kind of thing. It's both between you and your unconscious, but also getting it out there to where someone else can connect to it. And in my own work, I think we often start, or there's always pieces of ourselves that we're working with in our art. I know personally I've had a whole series of different times in my life where I've tried to paint not strictly narratively, but trying to kind of express what was going on and what was happening at that point, including having a little square journal notebook that I do mandalas and different pieces in that are kind of like a meditative, just creative piece that doesn't have a narrative but is trying to speak or work with those unconscious contents.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. And what you're making me think of when you talk about this is Well, first of all, by suggesting that art is actually communicating, you're giving it its own intelligence and its own autonomy on some level. And I really believe that that's true. And it makes me think of some interesting research I've read about Native American tribes, particularly, I think, the Mid-Plains tribes, who the author was talking about, and I'll see if I can find that book so that I can mention it more specifically, but the author was talking about how when the Native Americans in this particular culture dreams, that they would insist that the person who had the dream actually make some kind of an object that represented the dream. And it didn't have to be an exact replica of the dream or a dream character or something like that, but just something that had the essence of the dream. And the idea behind that was because the image or the object that came out of that actually could convey the immediacy of the sacred. You know, it was expressing some kind of the associated meaning and the unification of the dream itself, as if that article actually had the power of the dream, but it was brought out into the real world. And this has stayed with me for a long time. Actually, the name of that book is called The Dream Seekers, Native American Visionary Traditions of the Great Plains by Lee Irwin, IRWIN. But I just felt like when I read that, you know, they didn't really care if they were artists or not artists, probably in that case. They just cared to be able to, I guess on some level, have the dream be able to speak through the article that they were making. So it became a very sacred kind of article. And what you're saying kind of makes me think of that same sort of thing, in the sense that art is sacred. Art is speaking something. Art does have its own voice and its own way of getting out into the world to each one of us.
Exactly. And, you know, that follows in line with Jung. Of course, one of the things I'm interested in is that Jung has had this famous argument that within Jungian psychology, people still try to unpack and answer, but he was doing his own work in that sense, allowing the images and the creativity to have its autonomy. And then he asked himself this question: what is it that I'm doing? And a voice, and he said it was a female voice, said it is art. And he came back and said, no, it's not art, it's nature. And that's a whole other discussion. In fact, that's something that I hope to play with more in my dissertation ultimately. But it's fascinating that he has this legacy of creativity being very important, and yet not in that moment comfortable with calling it art. And I think part of that's due to the fact that at that time art had a very specific, you know, boundary that I think we have less these days, that we can see these forms or these creative practices as having their own energy and their own potential. And he was focused on taking his work out theoretically and at that time the scientific mode of psychology. But it doesn't take away from the idea, as you say, that it has this way of dialoguing with us, and it has this way of expressing things, and it has not only personally, but it has messages or ideas that can connect culturally with other people. And that, to me, is the real, you know, is the power of creativity.
Yes, I can't remember who said it, and probably multiple people, but there's this idea that artists are often on the forefront of the revolution. Like, they know it's coming. They're painting or creating imagery around, whether it's art, visual art or poetry or whatever it is. They are creating the imagery around what's coming, you know, down the pipeline, because they're on the forefront of this, and they're conveying the ideas that are actually in flux and initiating transformation even as they are happening. So it's almost like a channel, I think, on some level. So I think it's really profoundly important. And I will just say this for myself as well. I don't really claim to have many traditional artistic skills of my own. It's not something that I've ever really taken the time to learn those skills. But I do believe that if each one of us will really allow that space in our own lives for the creative function to come through, i.e. the collective unconscious, because in the end, that's really what it is. I think we've both sort of said that in different ways. Then there's something very powerful in a way that allows us to transform our own selves, and also ultimately the culture will receive that kind of wave that's coming out from whatever the work is that we do, just as it did with Charlotte and just as it has now with Jung in such a big way, and obviously with your own work, and any of us who are willing to take advantage of that opportunity and actually put ourselves out and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the thing, ultimately, when I started, as I said, I was looking at Charlotte's work from an activist artist. That's one lens, but looking at her work and seeing where at a time that seemed very hopeless, in fact, early on in Berlin, when restrictions started happening to Jews, she was able to get into an art school and start painting. And her family life, she had a stepmother who was an opera singer, and so there was music in her life. And these things, and including writing, were ways for her to still express and show that her life mattered. Charlotte's work, like you said, speaks out beyond what she did. It has a basis for feminism, for feminine voice and relational information. It has both about race information and it's also about creativity. Those things in there are in the work that still, I think, speak to us today.
Absolutely. I think that's a very profound insight. And I had the chance to read your article, Lisa. I hope that everybody else will be able to pick that up when they get an opportunity. It's in the International Journal of Jungian Studies, Volume 8, Issue 2, June 2016. So as we mentioned, very recent. And the title of that article is Transformation Through Art, Exploring Jung's View of Art and the Relevance of Charlotte Salomon's Life or Theater, ?
Yeah, the article takes one facet about transformation, but I didn't get to really have the space to compare it to the Red Book and really go deep into that. And I want to play with that whole question of, what is art and why was it that it was a woman's voice and bring in more the feminism into that.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Lisa, this has been just such a fascinating discussion. You can learn more about Lisa at her website at www.mandalamentoring.com. And again, be on the lookout for that article if you can get your hands on that. And Lisa, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. It's just been so fascinating.
Oh, thank you, Bonnie. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright.